Hello again, and welcome back to Educator.com's Advanced PHP with MySQL course. In today's lesson, we're going to be continuing development of our web application, incorporating what we learned in our last lesson on constructors. In today's lesson, we're going to be providing an overview of the new version of our web application, which uses constructors, which is version 7.0, and then we're going to go over all of the different constructors that we've created. We basically have three objects, or three classes that we use within our web application: the item class, the department class, and the customer class, and we're going to discuss how those constructors work for each of those classes and how they're used within the web application. So as mentioned, for this version 7.0, constructors have been created for all of our objects that we have: item, department, and customer. And basically everywhere where we've created instances of the objects, before we've used the new statement, now we're using the constructors that we've created, and all of our constructors, as you'll see in a minute, take arguments. Whereas before, for example, we were just creating a new item with a statement like this, with something over here, a variable. Now, because we've created constructors that take arguments, we'll be declaring or creating instances of objects using sort of this syntax over here, where we'll actually be passing argument values to our constructors. And that's something we learned about in the last lesson. Additionally, for our constructors, we're actually providing, for all the constructors we have, we're providing the ability to set all of the different property values for that object. For some of our constructors, the values are not known. For example, when we create a new item object from our additem.php page, we don't actually know what the item ID is and the image file extension is yet, or are yet, because those get extracted and created in the insert item function. So when we actually initially create these item objects, we're actually going to be passing null for some of the parameters because we don't have values for them so far, or yet. So basically the item class that we have, we created a constructor for it, and it takes arguments for each of the different properties that the item class has, like item ID, name, price, description, and so forth. And the way we work with inside the constructor is if any properties are not supplied to the constructor, or they're empty, then we just set those properties to a default value of an empty string. And if you remember from our lesson on constructors, that's part of what we do, or part of what constructors are used for, is to basically set up an initial state of a particular object. And in this case, we're making sure that all of our values for an item class have at least a basic value set. So let's take a look actually at the item class in version, this is a new version 7.0. And we can see that we've created a constructor. Let me blow this up a little bit, which, as we know, is a magic method, which is named __ construct. And as we can see, that the signature for this method or the prototype for this method is to take a string ID, a string name, a float price, a string for the description, and a string for the image file extension. If we actually go down and look at our constructor here, this is the body of the constructor. Basically, all that it does is it goes ahead and using this keyword, which we know allows us to get access to a particular object instance's properties. We're going to set, for example, the item ID, and if an item ID is passed in, so therefore it's not empty, we're going to set it equal to the item ID passed in. Otherwise, we're going to set it equal to the empty string. And we do this for all of our different variables. And what that does is that at least gives them a baseline value, at least gives them a, for example, they'll all at least have an empty string value so that they're at least initialized. And the different places that this new item constructor is used in, the first place, for example, is in additem.php. So if we take a look at additem.php, and we look at the old version, which would be version 6.0, when we create an item object in the data processing section, we previously had just used the new statement that said new item parentheses parentheses, and because we hadn't declared a constructor before no constructor gets called, So then what we would do afterwards is we would manually go ahead and set each of the different properties of this new item. For example, the name, the price, and the description. Well, now these statements can all be incorporated into one constructor function call or method call. So here we say new item, and then we have our parentheses as we normally do when we're declaring a new instance of an object. But now we can provide argument values for all of the parameters of the constructor. If we look back at our documentation for the constructor, we can see that it takes 5 different parameters for each of the different properties. So because of that, we have to pass it 5 different parameters. In this case, right now, because when we use our add item form, we haven't generated an item ID yet that has to be gotten from the last added file, and we haven't got the item or the item's image file extension because we extract that from the image file that gets uploaded, and we do that in our insert item function. So we only have the name, price, and description for which we can specify to the constructor, but because it takes 5 arguments, we need to provide values for the other ones, and in this case, one of the standard ways of doing that is just providing the value null. So this basically creates the item object and sets these 3 properties, and it's does the same thing as this here because of the way our constructor works. The other spot that we use our new item constructor is in build item object, which is a function in our file library. So if we go look at build item object, we can see that what we do is we have, again, here's an example of our new constructor. It's got the open and closing parentheses, and then in between it has 5 different arguments. In this case, when we build an item object, or when we use this build item object class, we're building an item up from data fields that were extracted from a line in our items data file. So here you can see we're just, for example, the item ID, we're basically pulling the first data field from a line in our items file, and we're running the trim operation on it. And this allows us to go ahead and set the ID, the name, the price, the description, and the image file extension for this particular item. Now, because we use this build item object function to build an item object up from a file in our items text file in our database, that items file already has all of the information about a particular item, so we don't have to use null here for either the item ID or the image file extension, which is why all 5 of the parameters to this item constructor are passed values. So we've sort of done the same thing, basically done the same thing for our department class. We've just created a constructor for it, and it takes arguments for all of the different properties that a department has: its name, its department ID, and then the items, which is an array of index array of all the item IDs of the items in the department. What we do in the constructor is for the department ID and name property, if those are not passed a value when the constructor is called, they get set to the empty string, which is similar to what we did in the item class for any properties that weren't passed values. For example, if we pass in the value of null, that's considered empty. We're going to set a value for the properties equal to the empty string, just so they have at least an initialized value. Additionally, if the items property is not passed in, so if we don't pass in an index array of item IDs that represent items in the department, then we're going to be initializing items to an empty array, and that's because it's an array. It's an array property, and so when we initialize it, we want to initialize it to a data type that it's going to be used as. In this case, it's an array, so we use the empty array. So if we quickly take a look at the constructor for our department class, we can see we have construct. It takes a department ID, a name, and it takes items parameters. And what it does is, as said, it sets the department ID and name equal to whatever values were passed in, if they were passed in. Otherwise, it sets them equal to the empty string. And then it also tests if items was passed in. And if items was also, it also performs an additional test. If items is an array, then it goes ahead and sets items to the array that was passed in. Otherwise, it just sets items equal to the items property equal to the empty array. So this is another example of one of the things that the constructor allows you to do, is when you create an object, it allows you to sort of perform some data checking on any information that code provides to your particular constructor. What that allows you to do is make sure that your object stays in a sort of a state that you understand and that you know about. For example, if we hadn't checked this is array, for example, we could have passed in a string here, and then if we just ran the test to see if it was empty, then we'd actually be setting our items property, we'd be initializing it to a string value when in fact it should be an array. So this is an example of how we can use the constructor to make sure that our object always starts off in an appropriate state. And like with the item constructor that we created, we use our new department constructor in the build department object function. If we take a look at that, what we can see is, try and make it a little bigger. What we can see is that when we build our department object, we call the constructor and we provide it a department ID and a name. And in this particular case, where we use build department object again to build a department object from a line in the departments.txt file. And the way we do that is we initially pull the department ID and the name for the department, set it in the department object. Then what we do is we loop over that last data field in departments.txt, which is a common delimited list of all of the item IDs in the department. So then what we do is we use the add item function, if you remember, to add each of those item IDs to the items array of the particular department we're building. Because we essentially do that after the department is already built, for the items parameter of the department array, we actually initially pass it the value of null. And that's kind of like what we did for the items array. Then what we do is we basically loop over all of the item IDs that are part of that third data fields in each line of departments.txt, and then we use our department add item function to add each item ID to the items array. And if we actually go and look at that again, we can see that all the add item does is it basically checks to see if an item ID is already in the department, and if it's not, it adds that to the items array. So between the combination of using the constructor and then this add item function, we're able to build up our department object. So the last class that we currently have in our application is the customer class, and we've created a constructor that takes arguments for all of the properties of that class, first name, last name, street, city, apartment, so forth. And for any properties that aren't supplied when you call a constructor, we set them to the empty string. And again, that's just part of using the constructor as a way to initialize all of the properties of our new object to make sure that it's in a sort of a well-known state. And if we take a look at our customer class, we can see that we have the constructor method that takes 7 different parameters for each of the properties. As you can see here, the string properties that are part of a customer class. And if we look down at our construct method, it looks just very, very similar to our item class in that it basically it tests to see if any particular parameter passed in was set. If it is, it sets the object's property value equal to the value passed in. Otherwise, it sets it equal to the empty string. And the place that we use this new constructor is in checkout.php, which is where we actually build up this customer object from the data a user submits when they're checking out on our web application. So if we go look at checkout.php, first let's look at the old version, version 6.0. We can see in this section, in the data processing section, where we're completing the order, which is after the user has entered all of their shipping information. We can see that what we did in the last version was we created a new customer object, a new instance, and we use this sort of default syntax. Because we hadn't defined a constructor, no constructor in this case is able to get called. So what we have to do then is we manually go ahead and we set each of the different properties of our of this new customer object, and in this case we're doing it from data that was passed in via the post method. So we're accessing this customer data associative array, which contains all of the information about a new customer. Now, in our new version, we've done the same thing, except we've incorporated this all into one statement, and it's a call to the customer constructor. So instead of just calling customer with 2 parentheses, as we did before, we call it with parameters, and basically what it's doing is it's passing the first name, last name, street, apartment, city, state, and zip code all to that new customer constructor that we created. and then that constructor is going to be able to go ahead and set all of the properties of that particular customer object. And so that now we've basically turned into this one statement that created a new instance, and then all these other set statements, or basically setter statements for setting each of the properties, are now combined into one constructor operation, our constructor method call. And that also would, because it does that, that would also allow us to, within the constructor, make sure that valid values are passed in. For example, if we wanted to make the application a little more robust, we could do things like check to make sure that the zip code is a valid zip code. We could check to make sure that the state is only 2 characters and it's a valid state, abbreviation, and so forth. And so that's, again, to reinforce, that's what the purpose of sort of the constructor is to get your new object that you're creating initialized and sort of get it in an initial state to which it can be used, where all the data contained in it is valid, is essentially valid data, or at least if no proper data was provided, at least has default values that you can work with in other functions of that class. So that's how we used all the different constructors within our web application. That ends today's lesson. Thank you for watching educator.com, and look forward to seeing you next time.